Hello and welcome. I hope you're doing well. In this video, I'm going to be walking you step by step on how to build a PC. If you have different parts than I do here, don't worry, the process is mostly the same. Before we get started, I wanted to give a big thanks to everyone who has liked, commented, or subscribed. If you have any questions at all, I encourage you to leave them in the comments. I always do my best to connect with my viewers and answer questions to the best of my knowledge. With that said, let's get started. Before you start building your brand new rig, it's important to note a few safety tips so that you don't accidentally damage your components. Don't build your PC on carpet. Use a table or a flat surface. Built-up static can zap your components and cause damage, or in the worst case, kill them. For this reason, it's recommended to wear an anti-static bracelet if you have one. Also, when handling your CPU or any components, don't touch the pins or contacts. Your hands have oils, moisture, dirt, and more that can cause a number of issues. Try not to touch any exposed circuitry at all. Make sure not to over-tighten any screws in the case or on the motherboard, as this could cause damage as well. If possible, make sure to give yourself plenty of room when building, because you're going to have a lot of parts laying around and you don't want to mix any of them up or lose track of any of them. Lastly, it's important to make sure that your components are compatible. If you aren't sure, I'd recommend asking an experienced builder or just using PCPartPicker.com to check and see if your parts are a match. So what do you need to build a PC? The only tools I used when building this computer was a Phillips head screwdriver. I used two screwdrivers, a longer precision screwdriver and a stubby one with a larger head. For the most part, a Phillips head screwdriver will be all you need, but it would be smart to have a small toolkit nearby just in case. So grab that screwdriver and let's build a PC. The very first thing I like to do when building a PC is to pop in the CPU. In this build, we're going with the brand new 6-core, 12-thread Ryzen 5 5600X. We'll be pairing it with the X570 Elite motherboard from Aorus. Take out the motherboard and set it on top of its box. Lift the retention arm from the CPU socket and grab your CPU. Keep from touching the pins on the CPU by grabbing it by the edges. Make sure that the CPU is installed in the correct orientation by locating the small golden arrow on the pin side. Then line that up with the arrow or indicator on the motherboard socket and gently drop it in. Don't push or apply any pressure when installing the CPU, but give it a gentle wiggle just to make sure that it's been seated properly. Once it's been seated, lower the retention rod back down and lock it into place. The next thing to do is install the memory. I'll be using Team Group's T-Force Excalibur Special Edition RAM. This 16GB kit runs at 4000 MHz at CL18, which should be a great fit for our Zen 3 CPU. And personally, I like the look of this RAM with the tribal pattern on the RGB diffuser. If you're using two DIMMs like I am here, open the clamps on slots 2 and 4, counting from left to right. If you're just using one module, it will go in slot 2. The modules only go in one way, so make sure that the notch on the RAM is lined up with the notch in the slot. Slide the RAM in and push until you hear an audible click, and see that the clamps have closed up again. Sometimes this requires more pressure than it looks like, so don't be afraid to apply pressure until you hear the click. Now we're going to install the SSD. In this case, I'm using an M.2 form factor SSD that slots right into the motherboard. This is Aorus's 1TB Gen 4 NVMe SSD, with read speeds of up to 5000 MB per second and write speeds of up to 4400 MB per second. This SSD will pair very nicely with the rest of our Gen 4 PCIe components. To install the SSD, first we need to unscrew the M.2 heat spreader that comes with the motherboard. Our M.2 size is 2280, so we'll need to install a standoff for its supported length. Luckily, the motherboard includes an extra M.2 standoff in the box. After we install the standoff, we can slot in the SSD. At an angle, insert the M.2 so that the contacts are touching, then push it down flat and screw it into the standoff. After it's screwed down, remove the plastic film from the adhesive on the underside of the heat spreader and reinstall it on the motherboard. Before we put the motherboard in the case, we need to install the AIO radiator. If you're using an air cooler, you can go ahead and put it on the motherboard. For this build, I'm going with Lian-Li's new Lancool 215, a case meant for maximum airflow that sports a mesh front panel and two large 200mm ARGB fans. I'm going to swap out the included fan on the rear panel with an ARGB fan from Cooler Master to match our other ARGB fans. Now it's time to prep our AIO for installation. We're going with a 240mm all-in-one liquid cooler from EK. Before we mount the radiator and the case, we need to install the included fans on the radiator. It's important to keep cable management in mind when installing the fans, so make sure you install the fans in a way that the two cables of the fans will be facing towards the back of the case once the radiator is installed. Using the included longer screws with threading just on the end, we can secure the fans onto the radiator. Now we can install the correct mounting hardware to the pump. Always refer to your AIO's user manual for info on what mounting brackets you need for your motherboard and CPU. Since we're using an AMD CPU, we'll be using the AMD specific mounting brackets. Grab the screws for the brackets and secure them to the base of the pump. This AIO comes with pre-installed thermal paste on the copper block, so we're going to be sure not to touch it while installing the brackets. I'm going to put the plastic protector back on until we're ready to install the pump onto the CPU. Now let's put the correct mounting hardware for the pump onto the motherboard. Some coolers use the stock AMD mounting brackets that come on the motherboard, but in our case, we need to remove them. But we will be using the stock backplate, so I'll leave it under the board. We can grab the thumb screws that our pump will be mounted to and screw them in thumb tight but firm with the longer threads pointed up. Now that our mounting hardware has been installed, we can put the radiator in the case. You can choose multiple orientations for your radiator, but here we're going to go with a top-mounted exhaust setup. We'll need to remove the dust filter from the top of the case and grab the short mounting screws for the radiator. Align the radiator with the cutouts in the case and begin securing your radiator by threading each screw in a cross pattern. Be sure each screw is threaded firmly but not over tightened. It may be easier to lay your case down on its back for this step. Now that the radiator is in place, we can lay the case down and install the motherboard. We're going to remove the pump outside of the case to get it out of the way for now. Take your motherboard and lay it inside the case, lining up its mounting holes with the standoffs in the case. In mini chassis, standoffs are pre-installed, but if they aren't in your case, they will be included with the case hardware. I'm using a full-sized ATX motherboard, so there will be 9 standoffs for each mounting hole to be screwed in. Find the mounting screws that came included with your case hardware and start screwing in your motherboard in a cross pattern. Once the motherboard is installed, this would be a good time to remove any plastic protection film. We don't want to leave the pump hanging out of the case all day, so let's go ahead and install it onto the CPU. If you don't have pre-applied thermal paste on your pump, then this would be a good time to apply your thermal paste to your CPU. Grab the pump, align the mounting hardware, and gently press it down onto the CPU. In my case, when test fitting the pump right side up, there was a kinking in the tubes that I didn't think looked very nice, so I opted to install the pump upside down, which is perfectly fine and won't affect its functionality, but it did flip the EK logo upside down. Gotta do what you gotta do for aesthetics, I suppose. Now that the pump is in place, we can tighten it down with the included thumb screws. These thumb screws come with retention springs to ensure that the appropriate pressure is applied to the CPU by the copper block. Slip the springs over the threaded screws and start firmly tightening the screw in cross pattern. Now that the pump is on, we can set the case upright and feed the ARGB cable from the pump through the cable cutout in the top of the case. Since the CPU pump header is already so close, we'll go ahead and plug it into the motherboard. To the left of the gray fan header above the RAM, there's a CPU pump header, so that's the one we'll be plugging it into. For cable management, I'll feed the rest of the cable through the cutout up top. Now would you look at that? It's starting to finally look like a PC. At this point, there are quite a few cables that we can go ahead and connect to the motherboard. We're going to start by connecting the front panel connectors of the case I/O to the motherboard. Just from looking at the back of the case, the many cables can seem overwhelming. I'm here to tell you it's not as bad as it may seem. Inspect your cables and find the ones coming from your case I/O. In this case, we have cables for the power and reset buttons, LED button, and USB 3.0 ports, as well as our 3.5mm audio jack. We'll start by routing these cables individually through the cutout that is closest to their headers on the motherboard. The HD audio cable should go through the farther cutout on the bottom, and the power, reset, and LED cable should go through the closer cutout on the bottom. I routed my USB cable through the bottom cutout, but it wasn't flexible enough to make the bend, so I rerouted it through the lower cutout on the right. First, we'll connect the HD audio cable to its header on the bottom left corner of the board labeled Audio. Make sure that the pins are lined up and connected. Now we'll connect the USB cable to the header labeled USB 3.0.1. There's a notch in the top of the connector to make sure that it goes in the right way. Then we'll take the power, reset, and LED cables and connect them to their front I/O headers on the board, all located in the same spot. Each pin is labeled on the motherboard so that you can see where each connector goes. Aorus motherboards come with a nice little connector for this they call the G connector. It has a labeled slot for each of the small front panel connectors. I like to use this so that I can plug all of the I/O cables in at the same time. Use the G connector if you have it, or plug all the small connectors in individually. Both will work perfectly fine. Now let's tackle some fan cables. If you're using RGB fans like I am, you'll have two cables coming from the back of each fan. One 4-pin cable for fan power and one 3-pin cable for the lighting. We just want to focus on the 4-pin PWM connectors right now. For our rear exhaust fan, we'll take the fan power cable and route it through the cutout in the upper left corner of the case. There is a fan header on the motherboard in the upper corner that we can use for this fan. Plug it in there, and then we'll pull some of the cable back through the cutout for clean cable management. Next, we can connect the fans on our radiator. These fans came with a fan splitter cable, so I only need to connect one PWM fan header on the motherboard for them both. If you have more fans in your case than fan headers on your motherboard, I'd suggest buying a fan splitter or a fan hub to use. We're going to connect both fans to this two-way fan splitter and then feed the end of the splitter through the upper right cutout on the case. Since these fans will be helping cool our CPU, we're going to connect them to the header labeled CPU fan next to where we plugged in our pump. Our large front intake fans came pre-installed and connected to an included fan hub in the back of the case, so we don't need to plug them into the motherboard. If you need to plug in your front fans to the motherboard, follow the same process. There will likely be 3 or 4 fan headers in your motherboard that you can use, or you can always get a splitter or a fan hub. So our fans have power, but now it's time for their lights. If you aren't using RGB fans, you can go ahead and skip this step. RGB is one of the leading causes of rat's nest cables in the back of PCs. While people have varying opinions on RGB implementation in their PC, I personally do not
I do not discriminate on a PC, whether it's a completely dark Batman PC or if it's got rainbow unicorn puke RGB. I, for one, have love in my heart for all PCs and dream of a world where all PCs are created equal.
Anyway, yeah, let's do some RGB stuff. The first thing you should know when implementing RGB into your build is that there are two types of RGB, standard RGB and addressable RGB, or ARGB. Standard RGB uses one static color in all of the LEDs on the component, while ARGB can use a different color in each of the LEDs on the component. Standard RGB uses a 12-volt 4-pin connector, while ARGB uses a 5-volt 3-pin connector. If you're using a newer motherboard from the last 2 or 3 years, chances are that you'll have both types of headers. If you're using more RGB components than you have headers on your motherboard, they make splitters and hubs for RGB as well as ARGB. Some products are now featuring a daisy chain function on their components, such as our Cooler Master and EK fans that we're using in this build. So we're going to be daisy chaining the ARGB connectors from our fans as well as our pump and connecting them to the included hub on the back of our case. This way, we only need to use one 5-volt ARGB header on our motherboard to control all of the lighting. First, we'll take the ARGB cable that is connected to our hub and feed it through the top cutout to be connected to a 3-pin header on our motherboard. Now we can start daisy chaining the pump and the fan ARGB connectors together. We'll take the connector from the pump and chain it to the rear fans header. Then we'll take the rear fans connector and chain it to one of the radiator fans header. Then chain that fans connector to the other radiator fans header. Now there's just one connection left at the end of our chain. This is the connector that you would put into an ARGB header on the motherboard, but since we're using our hub, we'll connect it to the header on the hub. Easy, right? That wasn't too complicated, was it? With all of our components in the case connected where they should be, it's time to put in our power supply. You know what that means, more cables. For this build, we're going with Cooler Master's MWE gold rated 750 watt fully modular power supply. Kind of a mouthful. 750 watts should be more than enough for our build, and with it being fully modular, we can only use the cables that we need without causing any extra clutter. So let's go ahead and take out our power supply. We're going to need the 24-pin ATX power cable, the 8-pin CPU power cable, one of the two 8-pin PCIe power cables for our graphics card, and the SATA power cable for our hub in the back of the case. We'll plug in our cables before putting the PSU in the case, starting with our 24-pin ATX cable. Plug in the split end of the ATX cable into the power supply and make sure that you push until you hear it click into place. Then plug in the CPU power cable into one of the slots labeled CPU/PCIe with the end that's labeled CPU PSU. After that, we'll connect the PCIe cable into the slot next to the CPU with the end labeled CM PSU. Lastly, we'll connect our SATA cable to one of the slots labeled IDE SATA. Now we can slide this puppy into the case. Be sure to point the fan on the power supply downwards when installing it. Line it up with the mounting holes in the back of the case, grab the provided screws and screw it into place. Now that our PSU is in place, we can hook up our power connections to the motherboard. Starting with the 24-pin ATX cable, route it through the cutout closest to the 24-pin header on the motherboard and plug it in. Push until you see that it's in completely. Next, we'll take the 8-pin CPU power cable and route it through the cutout in the upper left corner of the case. Plug that into the CPU power header in the top left corner of the motherboard. This can be a bit hard to reach with our AIO in the way, but if you have skinny fingers like me, it shouldn't be too hard. After that, we'll take our PCIe cable and route it through one of the cutouts. This one is for our graphics card, so we'll just leave it for now. Last up is our SATA power cable. This can be used to power all sorts of stuff like fan hubs, SSDs, and hard drives. We'll only be using it to power our fan hub, but there are multiple connectors on the cable should we ever need them. Hide all those cables under the PSU shroud and let's move on to the GPU. When you get to the graphics card installation, you know you're getting close to the end. For our build today, we'll be using the coveted RTX 3070. This is Gigabyte's Gaming Eagle Edition. Before we pop it in, we need to open the locking tab on our PCIe slot and remove the second and third expansion brackets from the back of the case. Once that's done, grab your GPU and slot it into the motherboard until you hear a click and see that the locking tab has closed again. Screw in the graphics card with the screws from the expansion brackets so that the card is held in nicely and firmly. Now we can plug in our PCIe power cable into our graphics card. Since this card uses an 8+6-pin connection, we'll have to use the extra 6-pin connector on our power cable. It doesn't look the prettiest, but hey, you can always get sleeved cable extensions in the future. The moment of truth is now upon us. Plug your PC into a wall outlet, flip the power switch on the power supply, and press the power button on your case. If everything lights up and the fan starts spinning, you've done well. But we aren't out of the woods just yet. We need to make sure that our PC can post to a monitor. If your PC posts and sends you right into the BIOS, then congratulations. You've successfully built a PC. Quick disclaimer, I did have to flash the BIOS on this board for the new Zen 3 CPUs before this build was able to post because I bought this board pre-Zen 3 release, but it was very easy to do and it only took about 5 to 10 minutes. After making sure everything is functional, you can power off your system and do a bit of cable management in the back of the case. Just be sure that the PC is unplugged. Now all you need to do is install Windows or an OS of your choosing and start enjoying your PC. And that's going to wrap up my build tutorial for this video. If you want to build a PC, you can do it. Remember, there are many people on the internet that are willing and able to help you or answer your questions. Speaking of questions, if you have any that I didn't answer in this video, feel free to ask me in the comments. I'd be happy to help. What kind of content do you want to see next? Would you be interested in seeing benchmarks from this build? Let me know what you think. I appreciate all the feedback and I'm super grateful for everyone that watched. Thank you all, and I'll see you in the next one.
I love you for sentimental reasons. I hope you do believe